That voice. Okay, so I think this is a timely discussion. Our group, we have some younger folks, and we have some folks that are elevated in age, we could say. Um, if Gene was here, I know he would raise his hand in jest. Uh, but I, but it is a really good opportunity to talk about. Yeah, I keep my hat indoors. Yeah. My hair isn't inspiring, but for other reasons, I find it energetically beneficial, if you can believe that.
I can believe it, but
Yeah,
I go sometimes to hair issue too, especially I'm on video and I don't feel like brushing my hair and getting
right.
myself together. I just throw it on. I said, but Ernest is on to something there. It's
Yep,
kind of comforting as well.
it is comforting. You're absolutely right. Yep. Okay, so I think we could talk about this from, the basic perspective of the practice, and that's the maybe the first way that we could talk about it. And then I'll connect this to what I think is consistent throughout space and time, cultures that are separated by space and time, and those consistencies keep showing up. So you guys know how I feel about those types of consistencies. That has always been one of the things that I think point to actuality, is when it is consistent across cultures, it's consistent across, groups of people, societies that are separated by space and time, different continents, different time periods, and yet they're coming to similar conclusions. What does that mean? It means that we're likely observing something very similar and coming to similar conclusions. So if you're in the beginning of this practice, chances are sickness is going to take you off base. You will very likely, and I will say very likely, I don't want to put anybody in a box, but very likely a person who is kind of new to this practice will lose their points of attention, because chances are they're losing their points of attention anyway. That counterbalance phase where you're forgetting a little bit more than you're remembering, warrior training where we start to remember a little bit more than we forget, and we're kind of switching that dynamic. But being physically ill will derail a person faster than fast. Does that make sense? Pretty.
Makes sense, especially when you're remembering and forgetting a lot. The thing that happens to me when I started to remember at least 50-50,
Yeah.
at least 50% of the time. And when it was at that point is when I really understood from an experiential level that I prefer my existence when I'm remembering. My life in color when I'm remembering, and how I navigate it feels uh, preferable to my life when I'm not. And so when that happens, it doesn't derail you, because you go, wait a minute, where's my practice? And then you can feel the difference in just even that little example that I just gave.
Yeah.
That if I'm practicing, it definitely changes how I navigate, and it's more efficient. It doesn't necessarily take away pain, but it does reduce it to some extent. Um, it reduces some of the suffering. It reduces the emotional suffering that's going along with it, because you're trying to solve a problem or get out of your body, or be, change your environment, change your circumstances. And once it's the feeling, once you realize that doing it is better than not doing it, it's even more applicable. Well, I can get away with walking on the beach and forgetting my practice because I'm on the beach. But when I'm in the hospital and the shit's hitting the fan, I need my practice.
Mhm.
It's a whole different experience without it.
For sure. Yeah. And then, well, we both know that you always need your practice, even when you're on the beach. No coasting, Donna. But
Oh, I
yeah.
know. I'm just talking about, I can't fool myself into
Right.
thinking that there's no time for my practice now. I'm in an emergency circumstance. Like, that's when I need it.
So we'll kind of break this down, and then I'll get to this little picture, and what I mean by this little very crude drawing I got going here. The person with the box body, and yeah. So the first thing, and this will
Looks like my CAT scan.
really. Well, maybe we're onto something here. But this will be directly proportional to how much, I would even use the word skill, or how much practice a person has put in with their practice of paying attention, of engaging the present moment deliberately and on purpose with specific points of attention, or non-specific points of attention, depending on what's going on. You know, sometimes you might find yourself in a weird environment and you're like, okay, I guess I gotta, dig in and find something to give my attention to, because we're in a room in a hospital, there's no shadows, and maybe shadows is something I was giving my attention to that day. Here's the thing. If a person isn't used to doing this, if their practice is really quasi, am I saying that right? Quasi, Donna? Quasi? Okay. Peripheral and quasi. So if a person's practice is just so-so, meaning that they're not really doing it, that we can understand a wide variety of things intellectually and conceptually, and then do absolutely nothing with it. That's a thing. It's a condition we put ourselves in sometimes. So this first point will be directly proportional to a person's momentum with practice. If you have no momentum, you're going to lose your practice really quickly when you feel physically unwell. And it could be an emergency type of situation, or it can be more of a chronic type of situation. Doesn't really matter. If you are not as if you don't have as much momentum with your practice, if you're not as practiced, if you're haven't accumulated the skill from the consistency in the practice and the momentum from the consistency in the practice, it gets even more difficult when you're sick. But typically, one of the very first things that we do when we don't feel well is we lose our practice. So I'll write that down. We stop doing the practice. And just like Donna said, that's a time where we need our practice the most. So that's typically one of the things that we do first. Does that sound familiar? Maybe a little bit less to this group because we are more practiced. So maybe we just forget for a moment. And then like Donna said, it occurs to us like, oh shit, no, I really do need my practice, like especially right now. So what is the main thing that will happen? And I've already said it, and we had an entire class on it 2 Tuesdays ago. What is the number one thing that will always happen if we don't have our practice in place? What is very likely going to occur? We will fall below the level of active recognition. Deliberate intention and willful placement of our mind will fall to the wayside, and we're feeding the nemesis. Does that make sense? Michael, are you there? Does that make sense? I guess you don't have to answer. I don't like putting people on the spot. Ida answered. So the nemesis is a mind that is operating mostly by habit, mostly by memory, below the level of active recognition. Like, you're watching a movie, you're, taking the train to work, that you're interacting with people, but there's a different quality to it because the practice isn't in place. There's no intention and will in our triangle that I posted the other day are very far apart. And desire, who knows where the hell that is? Because we don't even know our desires half the time.
It's like your Wi-Fi isn't connected.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah. So when our Wi-Fi isn't connected, we become susceptible to ... So one of the things that we become susceptible to, I'll put this as number 2. No, I'll just put this as, these are not necessarily in any particular order. I'll just say that. So 1, we become more susceptible to other people's words, ideas, and beliefs. It is so easy to get swept up in somebody else's belief, an idea. It could be a diagnosis. It could be this, it could be that. And I'm not going to be super specific because this is kind of a general thing. The moment that we take away our volition and our will from our attention, according to the way that I've organized this information, we fall below the level of active recognition. It has a different quality. If we look at it in terms of like Tai Chi and formal practice, if you're in your head and you're thinking about what people are thinking about, or you're thinking, is this right or is this wrong? Or maybe you're listening to someone say something while you're trying to do your practice loses a particular quality that you can feel. Like if you really pay attention to it, you know that that quality of focus and intention is gone. Now put that back and you can quiet your mind, you can put your intention and your focus back into what you're doing. That's exactly the same when we're going throughout our day. When we fall below the level of recognition, I say ... because I don't know, and neither do you. We don't know what's influencing us because we're not actively recognizing our own cognition and our own behavior and even our own emotional soup, emotional intelligence. Things are going back and forth, and maybe we only notice it once it gets a little bit too back or too forth, and we're like, whoa, wait a second, where was I just now? So the number one thing that happens when we feel ill is it derails the practice and we stop our points of attention. And if this occurs, then we fall below the level of recognition and we start to ruminate. We start to think about different things that could potentially occur. When a doctor or somebody gives us our diagnosis, we start thinking about that. Have you ever met people that have a lot of injuries and then they get around other people who have a lot of injuries throughout their life and all they do is talk about their injuries? They're like, oh, well, you know, I was at the doctor last week and this is, that's it. Yeah.
The hospital waiting room was all of that.
Yeah. And I'm not saying that's good or bad or plus or minus
Oh,
or
I know, it's
shouldn't.
insane. And it's,
Yeah.
this is terrible. This is horrible. This is a horrible hospital. Don't ever bring me here again. This is awful. And I'm like, you know, if you were in any other hospital at this time of day, you'd be waiting this long. If you went down the block, you'd be waiting this long. It's just the nature of the beast. I've been in business for I don't know how many years. This is a management problem. And I'm like, no, it's not really, but I'm going back to sleep.
So here's an interesting point, and I said this to Shayna, that if I was a CEO of a big company and or let's say I was the owner, like whatever, and I wanted to hire somebody in an important position, I would ask them to take me a drive somewhere, and I wouldn't tell them what I'm doing. I would just say, can you drive me to such and such place? It's about an hour drive. Do you mind giving me a lift after the interview? Little do they know that's a part of the interview, because a person will show their mind when they drive. There's certain things that a person does that typically is below the level of active recognition, and their personality will shine through. You'll see a lot about their mind and the way they do things. And if you're wanting to hire somebody, well, it's your job in that particular example to come to some sort of discernment and judgment as to whether you should hire that person. So I wouldn't do that to you all because I'm not your judge. Like, that's not my place to do that unless you ask me to. But then the experiment is spoiled if you know that I'm watching your driving. So that has to be a part of it. You can't know that that's what I'm doing. The same thing will occur when things don't go your way and when you don't feel well. So the mind will betray its most consistent nature. I don't want to say true nature but it's most consistent, what it's most used to doing, its default position. When things don't go your way, the basement has flooded, and now all of a sudden your practice is gone and you're, woe is me and all of that. And when you don't feel well, the worse you feel physically, typically, if you're not practiced, you haven't been doing this for very long, you lose your practice right away. And a person's personality will just spew out of them, because a lot of times people are modulating their personality for whatever reason. Does that make sense? And especially if they're thinking thoughts that are opposed to their actions. So I go into a room and I'm smiling at everybody, but I'm thinking how much I hate you all and how I don't want to be here. If any of those three things happen, we go for a drive without you knowing it. Something happens that you don't want to happen, like your basement floods, or you get in a car accident, or whatever it is. Or you start to feel physically ill. There's other things too that will betray a person's personality, but that's typically when shit starts to come out. Does that make sense? And again, not plus or minus, not good or bad, but the reason that this would occur in this group is because it was a type of force. We could look at it as an issued force, and we're not adapting to it. Does that make sense? We're not present enough, we're not in our practice enough to elegantly adapt to the incoming force of other drivers, or in this case, sickness and illness. Does that make sense? Yes, William.
Yeah, it's interesting you're talking about this. And in that regard, is something I just realized the other day, and how my practice just has my awareness at the moment, how the practice has helped. And I was with a couple, a friend of mine, a husband and wife, and I happened to be sharing with them about a situation that took place with myself, with someone I'm seeing. And what was very interesting is that my friend's wife, she is a very strong, opinionated person who I very much admire. I admire them as a couple. I look up to them. I appreciate the way they interact with each other, the way they crafted their lifestyle together. And so I say that to say that what they say has an impact on me. And I don't see them very often now at this point in my life, but at one point I did, and I was, and the reason why I make that distinction is because I can tell that my awareness of myself in the moment and my feelings and my I can observe it differently, so that the advice they give to me has a different, is there more filters of awareness for it to travel through than what I previously did when I would get advice from them. So when she said some things, I realized that her judgment about, because anytime you tell someone something about something you're experiencing, they don't have all the information. They can only go by what you can verbalize to them. The other feelings you're having with your experience with a person, that doesn't come to light in the dialogue that you're sharing with a person that you're getting counsel from. But whatever her mood was, or whatever her headspace was that day, her reaction was so very judgmental that it impacted me in a way that if I wasn't like mindful and practicing, I would have attached more to what she said, and it would have kind of really knocked me in a different direction than I was feeling about what my real experience was. I would attach to all the other things, but because I had a grounding in that, I was able to kind of hear her and see her as she was saying what she was saying. I understood that her own experience was coming through very clear in a way that in the past I may not have been as tuned into. I may have been more caught up in just my own feelings about what I was saying, and my idea of them as a couple and their level of maturity as opposed to mine at that time or whatever. And I've known them over 20 years. So we've gone, so, but at this particular point, it was just very interesting that I was able to feel the emotional reaction I was having to what she was saying. I was able to hear her place where she was coming from. And I was able to kind of dissipate all of that very quickly, and and not take any offense or even judge her, because I could see better now that I could look at her differently, like, oh, you tripping. I didn't go into that. I was able to navigate that in a very different way. But, and to tie that into saying about being ill, is that when you're like illness, everything that happens when you're ill makes you're such more susceptible to the emotional effect of it, because now you're so concerned with all the outcomes that are very critical to like your health, your safety, or so yeah, that's why the practice is so important, because there are certain times when you're just more emotionally vulnerable, all these other things, and so you get more wrapped up into things in the solidity, and then your health is one of those things that really tests your all of that, and so I really noticed that in that situation, and wow, like I feel the impact of what she's saying, even some judgment that she has about me, because like I said, I've known her for very long. So she was trying to point out some things that she may have saw in me 10, 15 years ago in this conversation. It really doesn't have anything to do with it, but that's her concept of me from a long time ago. And all of that happened so instantaneously, but because of where I was able to maintain my attention, none of it pulled me. I didn't react to her. I didn't carry, I felt all of it, but I didn't like let it linger with me. And when I was driving home, I was able to not I was able to dissipate the feelings of attachment to that in a way, and I knew it was that I was in a different place. I attribute it to a lot of the things I've done in my life, but also the consciousness that I'm holding now in my practice. It was very clear when I started feeling the emotional reaction. I just settled in. I aligned my posture. I focused on my breathing, and I went to a mantra and kind of that voice of power instead of getting attached to it and trying to express to her that no, you're saying. I didn't get into any of that. I didn't try to like let her know that what she was saying and how I felt about it weren't in alignment. And they were a couple, so they kind of were playing off of each other. So I was the third wheel there, kind of like getting bang, bang, bang. And I had to and I'm in their home, so I didn't want to get defensive. There was a lot going on, but I really understood at that moment another aspect of where like my practice was kind of grounding me and giving me a buffer from getting caught up in like a lot of different things that could normally happen in a situation like that.
It's funny, William, because before you signed on, and before we started recording, Ernest started the class with, because I was talking about just getting home from the hospital, about not only illness, but how when we're not practicing, we can get sort of into a hypnotic state about what other people are saying. We're existing below the level of recognition of what we're doing. So we're reacting off of the other. So we might take what they say as fact or as offense or whatever, but we are not present to engage and to see the principles at play and to be grounded in a space. So he was describing that's how class opened. So you weren't there at the time, but you just gave another perfect example.
Yeah, that's why I wasn't there at the time, but I felt that was it was like, wow, this is from what I heard just when I came on. I felt that that must have been the dialogue. And I can see the same thing when you're talking about a doctor who's explaining something to you. You could easily disregard your own knowledge about, no, well, the medicine I've been taking has affected my gut, and this is and that's important information for the doctor. And if you get so caught up in what the doctor is saying and other things, you may not give vital information to help the doctor kind of reassess and formulate, okay, wait a minute, well, she's telling me something that is critical. But if you were so caught up in that, you wouldn't have been able to rebalance enough and say, wait a minute, there's a piece of information that the doctor doesn't know that I didn't.
And it's not just standard, it might be standard protocol for the majority of the people, but I know my experience and what I've had happen, and you need to know that, and I'm not willing to go with the narcotics or whatever.
Right.
So,
but it's important that the doctor know that. But if you're so caught up, kind of like disempowered in a sense that you don't share that information, then the doctor can't really assist you either with that information being in the game, And so, but if you get caught up,
you lose all personal power when you're not practicing. And that was one of the things I said just before you came on, is when you're remembering and forgetting, it's easy to forget when you think something's really important, like this emotional response to these two people telling you something, or whatever's happening at the hospital. I'm sick now. I don't have time to do my practice. There's something happening here. But when you get to the point, and you've obviously been practicing before this class, where the difference in how it feels to navigate with the practice, or how it feels to navigate. It's desired. It's a preferred way of being. It's a more efficient way to navigate. It's a preferred way to navigate. It's a engaged, present, grounded way to navigate a situation. And you can see the principles at play even with the other couple without judging them, or just seeing the principles at play. Wow, look at my reaction. Where's my practice? That kind of thing. And it becomes preferred. It becomes preferred even in the tough situations. You don't drop it. You pick it up when that happens, because you recognize that it doesn't feel good, and you want to feel that feeling of all the points at play and the balance. You want to be in better balance.
Yeah, and there's no defensiveness either. Like there's no need to push back necessarily. You're just observing what's taking place and not attaching to it and letting it like just derail you and affects your self-concept or your feeling about yourself or anything like that. And that's what was empowering. It's like I could feel my reaction to what they were saying, but it wasn't but I can let that happen and then reel it in and say, oh, okay, you're having an emotional reaction to what's being said, and some of it is because you feel they're being a bit judgy, or and it just, all that was very good, and like you said, yeah, it's very desirable
Because
because you're like,
you were operating above the level of recognition. You
yeah.
weren't operating below the level of recognition.
And it's important, and what you, like you're saying, and I totally agree, is like the more you have those experiences, the more it's desirable, because once you can once you see that that's what you're doing, you're like, all right, so then where else, and how often can I continue in a sense, like, how I want this to be more and more ingrained in my person,
And the
so that
dead
in other
giveaways,
more,
how does it feel? You
right,
felt yourself having almost an emotional reaction. You felt that pull towards that, and you decided, I'm not going there. I'm gonna do this instead. And then you didn't carry it with you. I mean, you felt the pull away from, you felt the pull toward being below conscious and being reactive instead of choosing your points of attention. You felt the difference happening, and so you chose differently.
and it's like it's a guy, I don't know if everybody's familiar with him, but he's like his name is David Goggins, and he does a bunch of videos on he runs marathons, ultra marathons, and does all this extreme fitness. But one of his things is, it's not the same, but I understand what he's saying. He says he pushes himself to the extreme in all these areas because you have to have a certain mental toughness. Oh, he's ex-Navy SEAL, so it ties into where he's coming from. But he goes into this whole mental toughness thing because his thought is that one day he's going to encounter some things in life that are going to be so difficult that if he hasn't conditioned himself in extreme situations where he had to control his mind, and that's a quite different thing, controlling in essence. But then when he experiences, he uses the death of his mother or something like that, he thinks he says those things will be the things that all this extreme training will have prepared me to be able to do. But I kind of think, in a sense, not the methodology, but the sense, idea, that's the same things, like this practice will prepare you for, because I think about that, like if I was to be sick and I just have all this time where I can't do anything, I'm just there dealing with it. How have I built up my practice to be able to manage in that space without going into all the fear and the worries, and it's just like erode my kind of like perceived development, because I really haven't necessarily done some like consistent deep practice over time. And I think that's
well, obviously you have, because you just recognized where
no, I have, but what I'm saying, going back to what Ernest is saying, is that when you're sick, though, that is like a surefire way to kind of like get thrown. Like, you may like in your normal life, you may not have the same things that are coming at you. So your practice is there and you're doing the work, but then illness is a different something else that you face that primarily affects you, because when you're ill, it's like, oh, like, everything gets switched a little bit, because unknown of that is different than a conversation I'm having with someone who I'm just, okay, I don't agree with you, I can walk away from this and whatever, but I can't walk away from my illness or something that is unknown going on. So that could cause my mind to kind of go to a different place, and then you forget your practice. I could just see how, in a sense, what I'm saying is like this deliberate practice will be so ingrained, so that, and when you encounter certain type of things that normally, even for someone who is pretty level and balanced, may get you off track. But if your practice really ingrained, you're better able to manage something like illness that would normally knock you off. So it's like, if you could prepare yourself, then you're better able to handle those things. But if you're early in your practice or at a different stage of your practice, then you may not have got that depth of so that illness will just knock it off, or that conversation could have knocked it off for me, or anything else. But I can see how illness is just, it affects you in a different place than some other type of experiences. So I can see that part of what the practice is to be, it makes the quality of your life better in general, but then I think it also prepares you kind of, in a sense, for some inevitable situations that many of us may experience, which is illness or loss, and some grieving or something else that if we are established in our practice, we'll still have to go through illness possibly and the physical effects of it, or loss and all the grieving and emotional effects of it, but we'll be able better to maintain our level of recognition because of the practice over time. That's all I'm trying to say.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Oh.
And it's all the same. What you find is what I've found, because I've been in the hospital twice, once on the 9th and once all day yesterday. And physical suffering, you know, like loud, my body was very loud. And engaging my practice decreased the suffering. Maybe not the actual physical ailment that was going on, but I do believe it did to some extent, because every thought that you think has an electrochemical response. So when you're thinking suffering thoughts, you're dumping a bunch of crap into your body. And I need my body to have as much healing stuff dumped into it as I can. So engaging my practice reduces the suffering, at least in my mind, and then I can navigate better. And I don't know, it's just it definitely comes from practicing in other circumstances where it is preferred. I needed my practice when I was feeling this, and I could easily, if I was early in my practice, go, I can't be doing this crap now. I've got real things to worry about.
Yep. And what you just mentioned, Donna, is that's typically the folly in the beginning of this practice. Is somebody is they think, and William actually pointed this out once upon a time, that we think that we need to think about things in order to get through them or to get past them, that it requires thinking. And so we'll really go in to heavy thought patterns, and then that could be in a wide variety of situations, going into important business meetings, going into important interviews, meeting somebody for the first time, and then we launch into these thoughts because we think that it's necessary, and then the practice is gone.
Yeah, and it was remarkable because I didn't remember to say those things to the doctor until I picked my practice back up, because I dropped it while he was talking to me. Okay, I don't have a blockage and I don't need surgery, but now, and he told me a bunch of stuff and I kind of yesed him to death, and he went out to go get the meds, and then I realized, wait a minute, where's your practice? And then I remembered the things I wanted to say to him. And I was almost going to talk myself out of it. Like, well, let him give me whatever. He's the doctor. And then no, I called him back in and said, I just want to discuss the meds you're going to give me before I get them. So I remembered those things because I was doing the practice. I didn't have to think harder to remember them. I had to slow my thinking completely and establish presence. And then that was available to me. So it's
Right.
the opposite of the way we've trained ourselves to think. Oh, this is really important, and I have to remember this, and I have to remember that, and I have to think, and I don't have time to do my practice because I have to hold all this information in my head. And it's really doesn't work that way.
That is not how memory is processed. You're correct. Yeah, that will really interfere with the processing of memories to be able to recall them later. So we right now we just covered a lot of stuff. So I will on our whiteboard here, I'll kind of organize everything that we just discussed. And then anybody watching this back, it'll be nice and organized for them. So we talked about a catalyst, and there are some catalysts that will feel like they can derail us easier than others. Maybe somebody, the catalyst is driving, maybe somebody, their catalyst is their cousin who always complains whenever they come over for Christmas. But what we've pointed out, and William did an excellent job of isolating this ingredient, is that our physical health is tied to our physical existence. And that's the great hunter. So when we feel more ill, or when we don't feel well, then that is typically the type of catalyst that will derail most people who aren't accumulating momentum with their practice. Does that make sense? The accumulation of momentum comes from consistency and continuity. The more that you do it, the more that you practice it, outside of catalyst, the more you're going to be able to adapt to catalyst. And this is all adaptation. Everything we've been talking about is how well do we adapt to situations that are well beyond our ability to control. And maybe not necessarily, we can prevent certain types of illnesses with certain types of behaviors and things like that, but that's not what I mean. If you're sick, you're already sick, you got there, and you're there. So ultimately what happens when we stop practicing is we fall below the level of recognition. And below the level of recognition could sound a little bit obscure to a person, but what we mean, and you can practice this for yourself, and you can feel the difference in the quality between attention that is deliberate and attention that is default. Yeah, you might say, I put myself here in front of this TV, this is all my choice. But the way to not hustle yourself with this practice is to determine the points of attention in advance. When you do that, when you practice that, you feel the quality, the differentiation between intention and will tied with your attention. So attention, intention, and the power of will start to come together. And you can feel the quality in that compared to when that's not there. That's a very basic principle that we start working with from day one. And that's the reason I tell somebody when they're beginning, and maybe throughout your practice, it just depends, determine the points of attention in advance. You will find how difficult that is to keep your mind where you want it to be. It is your mind. You put it where you want it to be. It was Joshua Grant who he was doing, I think he was doing Bagua actually. And he's like, my body didn't arrive here accidentally. He said, it comes from training, it comes from practice, it comes from the continuity and momentum of practice. And my body is exactly where I put it, not because I thought it there, not because of habit, but because I'm intending it to be where I want it to be. And then a light bulb kind of went off for me. And I'm like, that's exactly what we're doing with our mind. So if that's not occurring, we fall below the level of recognition, meaning that the intention and the power of will is no longer necessarily tied with our attention. Our attention becomes like a water hose again, and it's just going all over the place. You can see this really easily with people in their eyes, where maybe they're walking down the street and their eyes are just going all over to different things. I'm not saying that's good or bad, plus or minus. I'm just saying that is usually an example of a person whose attention is not deliberately placed into the moment because they're just being pushed and pulled. When we go below the level of recognition, we become susceptible to ... And that's the nemesis. William could have been susceptible to a reaction to what his friend was telling him. And he could have just, blown up in someone else's house and disrespected them. And, people are angry, and you'd be surprised how you could be friends for 20 years. And then one little thing happens and now we never talk to each other, for the next 5 years. And then it's like, well, this wasn't worth it. This little thing didn't need to blow up into what it was. All of that can occur below the level of active recognition. Does that make sense? So I'm really highlighting what is active recognition. It is deliberate. The way to make sure that you're doing it is to hold deliberate points of attention that we intend in advance. When we're not feeling well, when we kind of feel these catalysts that we need, the power or the introduction of force, I'm using my fist to kind of show force is coming in. We have to adapt to that. And if we don't, then we're going to respond to it in a way that isn't probably as efficient. When we're sick, what that starts to look like is our mind starts to create psychological time. We start to think about the future a lot, and then we start to maybe even think about the past, like, why did this happen to me? What did I do? What did I eat? Again, in itself, it's not necessarily plus or minus, but if we're below the level of recognition, this starts happening without our intent, without our wanting it to occur. It just starts to occur. And what Donna pointed out is that with physical suffering, if we fall below the level of recognition, and I'll put this as the third point, is we start to introduce psychological suffering to our physical suffering. And then they start to feed one another. So sometimes we can add so much mind suffering that will translate to physical suffering. It will start to create that in our body, because Donna, put that very clearly. Every single thought that we think has an electrochemical, physiological, and hormonal response to some extent. And we're always this soup of emotion and chemicals and electricity and all of this stuff, and the unseen, whatever you want to call it. Sometimes I just like calling it the unseen, whatever the unseen aspect of the human body. We know that our heart is creating an electromagnetic field. We know that our heart itself is electrical, that we use electricity or a strong vibration to get the heart beating again. So we know that there's an unseen aspect. We can all agree on that. We don't have to get too much into trying to divide that up or dice it up or understand it, which I think to some extent can be another error when we try to take the unseen and make it, binary, plus and minus, good or bad, beneficial, unbeneficial. I don't think that's as necessary. But so the point is that when we fall below the level of recognition, we're very likely going to start to add the mind suffering to the physical suffering. And now you're suffering in both ways, and then they'll start to feed each other. In Donna's case, she had physical suffering first for whatever reason. And then if she hadn't had her practice in place, which, maybe she mentioned to a certain extent, she had to remember the practice because it was the type of catalyst that kind of wants to veer us away from it. Well, that lends to the psychological suffering, which will then lend to more physical suffering. So she's right. The moment that we take our mind back, we do feel a degree of physical relief. And that could be because we're not, dumping those chemicals into our body, but we're also taking away one of the two types of suffering that we're feeling, which is the psychological suffering. I've never met a human being who doesn't physically suffer and is incapable of physically suffering. I've never seen it, never in my life. I've heard these fanciful stories of people who don't physically suffer. I don't even want to entertain that. That's not something that's important to me. So, however, the psychological suffering is different because we create that. That is 100% our manifestation. We're putting that out into the world. So the reverse, or the other way that can work, is a person who's operating below the level of recognition can create so much psychological suffering that their physical body starts to hurt. And that is the condition of the United States of America and other countries, that the way that we're thinking is leading to all of these other issues physically. Does that make sense? And then of course,
Ernest, but I was thinking there as you were talking and as Donna was talking about physical suffering, my husband has a heart condition and his heart has been, I was going to say playing up, but you mentioned electrical, and it is electrical with him. The heart rhythm goes out and then he's feeling very weak and sick.
Yes.
He's booked in for a procedure on the 9th of January to get this looked at, fixed, possibly. But while it was out of line there, and it went back into line itself yesterday or the day before, while that was happening, I was in psychological suffering. I was watching him. I was in fear for him. And I was watching my own mind. Like, your mind has a way of tricking you that you need to worry, because I'm telling myself not to worry. He hasn't died yet. These things have happened before, and the surgeons didn't say come into hospital straight away, this is an emergency. But inside me, when I'm lying in bed at night, the psychological suffering that I allowed myself, when I allowed myself to go there, I could feel my body, my chest, my heart in fear.
Mm-hmm.
And to have a physical suffering like my husband is having, and like Donna is having, I don't know what's worse, is to have psychological suffering or physical. Sometimes I think I would rather be sick myself than be sick in my head about sickness.
Mm-hmm.
But what I was noticing was the way that your mind tricks you into believing that worry is necessary. Because I had stages throughout the days where I didn't worry. I just got on with things and I was practicing, and I wasn't worried. It was just at nighttime when I lay down that I had to do, like Jean mentioned, the breathing exercises and things to get to sleep. But my mind was saying to me, if you don't worry, you're a bad person. You're a bad person for not worrying about your husband, because if something happens, at least you'll know that you have worried about it first, which is crazy. But to listen to Donna talk about physical suffering, and I was just I was just feeling the psychological suffering and how it makes your body feel. While you were talking about it there, Ernest, it really does make your body feel terrible, and you're doing that to yourself by
Doing
thought.
that to yourself. Right.
if your practice isn't in place, and many times throughout that my practice wasn't in place, and when his heart went back into line itself, you can't kid yourself that the relief that's in your body, then the way your body feels, when the way my body felt, I wanted to get on my knees and say, praise the Lord. You know, just the relief, the feeling of relief is an incredible physical feeling as well. It's a physical feeling, the feeling of relief.
Mhm.
Of
Well, that
this,
feeling of relief showed you how strong your worry was. Because as soon as his heart went back in, you felt such relief that you wanted to fall to your knees and thank the Lord, which just shows you how much tension you were holding. So,
yes, and I was
and
kidding
how much
myself that
suffering you were causing
yeah,
yourself with your own mind, that it was
yeah.
that much relief. And it was probably almost more extreme than the suffering that he was having and the risk that he was. I know it's risky to be in arrhythmia for that long. You have more likelihood, if you exist with that arrhythmia for a long period of time, you could get a stroke or a heart attack, and that's why they correct it. They don't leave you with it. But so you've got that fact in your mind, and how much you focus on it definitely is relative to how much suffering you have.
Yep, that's true. I would say that's a little bit of a it's a related point. But yeah, Donna's right. So you know how we talk about inner peace? That's only because we've created inner turmoil, inner war. I look at a society in the future that doesn't have that term. They're like, inner peace, what are you talking about? Like we already have gotten out of our own way. So that word is a contextual word to describe coming from something. The word enlightenment, the feeling of enlightenment must have meant that you previously had a feeling of cumbersome burden. You know, you're encumbered and now you feel light. So that's what Donna's pointing out, is that to have that level of relief, you had to have that degree of stress and tension, because they rely on one another to exist to a certain extent. So one thing I'll point out, though, it was a consistency between Donna, William, and Ida, which is an indication of your practice. And it's is what I call hydrostasy, is that circle that we can feel. So there is a way for a person early in their practice to notice it a little bit after the fact. They're already starting to get angry. You know, maybe they've already said a few words that they wish they could take back. And then like, oh shit, I'm not doing my practice. I'm responding in a way that isn't elegant. This isn't elegant adaptation. This isn't going well. But that's not what I'm hearing from you guys. So what I'm hearing is that, and this is directly correlated to a commitment to being present, engaging the moment with volition, intention, and will. Now, you could see it and you could feel it. That's the thing, is that you can feel sooner and sooner and sooner when you start to come away from your preferred state of presence, solidity, and firmness in the moment. And I think that's a huge thing. So, because now, and I wrote that, I'll write this on the whiteboard too, is on the other hand, if we keep practicing, and anything misspelt, please just imagine it correct. If we keep practicing, one, we reduce psychological suffering, reduce mind suffering, and that can also reduce body suffering, but maybe not take it away. Oh, another thing that we'll do is we'll add mind suffering over here if we stop practicing, and we'll also try to control. And I can vouch to that. And I even mentioned it to Shayna because I started to notice it, but you know, I'm going through a pillow thing. I don't know what's going on, but my pillow, I wake up with neck tension and it's gotten worse. Last night is the first night that it doesn't feel like it's gotten worse, but it hasn't gotten better. So I could kind of see where there was the possibility for the error of trying to control. And what does that mean? That means that I'm going to spend my entire day trying to get my shoulders to not hurt. And that is an attempt to control. instead, I just do what I normally do and then make an adjustment in terms of my pillow and kind of go from there. But I'm not trying to get rid of it, because focusing on something that you're trying to get rid of very often will just inflate it. It will make it bigger because it's getting our attention more. Does that make sense? So, but if we are practicing, we reduce the suffering and we can maintain, and this is kind of what I wanted to point out that Donna, William, and Ida both had, was cognitive attention. I put the T for training, but the cognitive attention and the emotional intelligence, the emotional awareness is more pristine when we're still inside of our hydrostasy bubble. We haven't let ourselves go out of what I would call balance, a sphere of balance rather than a single point that's static and not moving. We're always kind of going a little bit left and a little bit right inside of this circle. As long as we don't go to an extreme and exist there, we'll be okay. Every now and then we will find ourselves in an extreme. We just can't live there. That's fine. You know, certain feelings that we feel that we really enjoy, it is an extreme, and that's okay. But if we get attached, if we try to cling, if we get fearful of losing it, then we start to exist in that extreme. We try to control and make sure that we're existing in that stream, and that will inevitably, in some way, I'm not a fortune teller, so I can't tell you exactly how, it will lead to suffering, psychological and physical suffering eventually, and it helps to create the conditions for suffering for people around you. So, but if we keep our practice in place because we felt ourselves moving left or right, I felt myself starting to do this through, and I'm like, wait a second, I don't normally do this throughout the day. Why am I doing this? Because I'm trying to control it. I'm trying to fix it. And what is this doing? It feels good now for a second. The moment I stop doing that, that pain's even worse, because now I'm focusing on it. I'm manipulating it. I'm overworking it, and it's just making it more tense. So I just need to go back to my practice, relax and breathe, and I'll get into that. But what I'm most inspired by this conversation is the recognition of how things feel and using that feeling to go back to the practice as a preferred state of being, because it's more intentional, it has more volition, more will, and ultimately what Donna said is more personal power. And I'll kind of round it up with this. And then I did want to talk about this person, but what happens when our practice is more pristine as opposed to when it's not, is this little triangle, and this is all just to help organize information. I like shapes and stuff like that, so it's kind of just an earnest thing, but other people do it too, but it's just a way for me to remember. And some of these things are really difficult to talk about because, you know, there's almost no separation between power of will. It's either there or it's not. Intention is either connected with attention or it's not. Does that make sense? So you can have a desire, but not necessarily intend to do it. Let's say you have the desire for world peace, but yet your intention, you don't align that with your desire. You're not going to get much out of that. But now let's say that you have the desire for world peace, you intend to do something about it, but then you don't. You don't really end up doing anything. You know, you play a video game or you watch TV or you hang out with friends and you end up not doing a damn thing. You didn't have any power of will. Does that make sense? And I'm just using words to describe things. These are just concepts to help organize the human experience. It's not absolute. There's other ways to look at this, I'm sure. This is just one of many. Now, when we're doing our practice, our attention is tied with all three of these things, at least to some extent. Where are you putting your attention? Why are you going back to your practice? Because it's desirable. Does that make sense? We're doing that because it's a desire. I can't tell you how many times my Tai Chi teacher would take me outside of our barbecue restaurant, sit me down and say, Ernest, what do you want? And I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, what do you want? What is your desire? And I'm like, shit, I don't know. Like, I don't even know what I want. So there were so many times where even that is confusing, or a desire. Where did it come from? Why do you want it? And I'm like, shit, I have no idea. So with this practice, desire becomes something that's a little bit more clear. And I'll get into that another time because that's not really the main point. But when we're doing our practice, and we're in that bubble of hydrostasy, which is a feeling of balance. We feel the balance. That's still this. We're still riding a wave. We're still surfing. We're still riding our skateboard. So it's not stagnant. Balance is not stagnant. There's always going to be a little bit of left and right. Close your eyes standing on one leg and you'll feel the micro adjustments that your body has to make to keep you balanced. So, but it's doing that all the time, no matter what. That's a great example of staying inside of that hydrostasy bubble just by standing. But when we start to feel that we're losing our balance on one leg, we're starting to go outside of that circle into an extreme. We can be there for a little while and come back. But if we're in that for too long, we fall on the floor and we got to get back up and start over. And that's okay. That's just an analogy. However, when we're doing our practice, when our attention is tied with these 3 points, we create what Donna called, and this is a feeling of personal power, the feeling of I can, the feeling of nothing is impossible for me. And we don't need words. We don't need to convince ourselves. It is a knowing. Now, the interesting thing about knowing is if it's really there, we don't have to try to convince ourselves and we don't have to try to convince other people. Remember when my teacher, I was at the barbecue restaurant and I told Long, I'm like, I'm over it. You know, I was talking about something all day and I'm like, but I'm over it. And he's like, stop. I'm like, stop what? Stop saying you're over it, because you're not. You're thinking about it all the time. You're not over anything. When you're over something, it will no longer come to mind, unless there's like something that reminds you, but then you don't have any reaction to it. But when something is no longer coming to mind, you have officially moved on. You're doing something different. If it keeps coming to your mind, you haven't let a damn thing go. It's very similar to what we're talking about here. So when our attention is pristine, our practice is in place, our mind is exactly where we put it, these 3 triangles get closer together. Our intention, our desire, and our power of will start to operate as one single unit. Does that make sense? And I think there's a lot of healing power behind that. More than any drug, more than anything anybody can give us, there's a lot. Personal power is the healing power. That's where it comes from. Does that make sense? And I'll relate real quick. I'll just relate this picture, because the way that I look at it, I don't look at it as accumulating. I don't look at it as holding on to something. I don't look at it as I have more personal power than Donna and we can't talk to Shayna because she's a low personal power person. That's all just a bunch of bullshit. That's just the kind of thing that humans do, is they create this plus and minus thing. But rather, it's a flow. And you'll see this in Tai Chi, you'll see this in all other kinds, not all other kinds, but you'll see it in cultures and systems of belief that are separated by space and time. They've come to similar conclusions. In Tai Chi, they'll call it heaven and earth, with the human being in between. Now, energy, and eventually this is felt. We can feel this energy, we can feel this flow. And that's usually when I stop talking about it. There's nothing really left to talk about. If we're feeling it, if it's moving, eventually in that hydrostasy bubble, we'll be able to feel whether this flow is smooth or disrupted. And that can also lend to a lot of healing power. Does that make sense? And so rather than accumulating, I have more than, you have less than, it's more just a flow coming in and a flow going out, in a manner of speaking. This is just a way of looking at things. It's not really representing what's actually happening, but it flows. The smoother that flow, the more the feeling of personal power, the more the feeling of I can, the more our imagination can become something tangible in our experience. We create, we become more creative, we become more connected to other people, to other creatures, to our environment. Everything starts to align. And we can feel in this practice when this isn't occurring. What is the number one thing that will mess this up? The way that we think. The way that we think will interrupt the smoothness of this going through our body as a type of conduit. So the way that we think will lead to the way that we behave, the way that we respond, and the way that ultimately we live our lives. All of that can disrupt the flow of the smoothness, the smooth ebb and flow of that energy going through us. And I'm using the word energy in air quotes, We're starting to talk a little bit about the unseen. So I'll just talk about how it works in the human being, but I'm not going to try to dissect and control the unseen. I think that's another error, just as error as the word perfection, the perfect human, seeing reality, real, there, even in ancient cultures, they go from one extreme to another. And I find that wildly erroneous. So we're just looking for a nice, happy medium here. So if our practice is in place, we can take this triangle, and I'll just point out that when we're not doing our practice, this triangle isn't a triangle. It's not balanced. Intention and will become very far apart. Desire just disappears sometimes. We don't even know where it's at because there's no balance. So those 3 points haven't created a geometrical structure that can create power. Does that make sense? And I'm just using words to describe things so that I can communicate. Is it really a triangle? No, I don't know. I'm just making that up. It's just a way to remember things. And when you spin a circle, you get a sphere, and sphere for me represents balance. So that's where my explanation comes from. But ultimately, if we lose our practice, if it was never in place in the first place, you can forget it. If you weren't practicing from the time that you woke up and you find yourself in a serious situation, your ability to adapt is highly compromised. Does that make sense? The basement has flooded and now we're cussing, we're throwing things around, and we've introduced psychological suffering to the event that's occurring. And so sometimes it would just think positive. Well, thinking positive is great, but the basement's still flooded. I need to adapt to that. I need to come to an elegant solution, through intention and will and desire. My desire is to not have a basement that's flooded. The intention and the will can become completely obscured in the mind that is just responding to habit. And one of the things that Ida mentioned is if we fall below the level of recognition, we have no cognitive attention training. We have no emotional attention training. We have no behavioral attention occurring. None of that attention is there. So not only are we feeding the nemesis, we start to feed what I call the destroyers. And Ida gave an example of, oh, you don't have basements there. Well, that's good. So the basement flooding isn't a good example, but maybe the wind knocking your house over or something in Ireland is. I don't know. But not having a basement, Ida, isn't the point, but it's a fun fact. So the idea is that if this practice isn't in place, our triangle that I've created that looks really neat on the other side is no longer neat. It is all over the place. Intention and will are completely far apart. We see that a lot with people in the world. We see a lot of people that have a lot of information, but their intention and will are miles apart and they don't get a lot of shit done. That's okay. I'm not passing judgment, but that's what's occurring. And then ultimately, and I just want to point this out, and then we can open it up for more discussion or questions, but Ida gave a perfect example of one of the destroyers creeping into her psychology and making it worse. Is the social convention that I should worry about another person, that I should let my own emotional state turn to turmoil. It's not a matter of should or shouldn't. If it does, it does, and we adapt and we get back up and we keep on moving. But then again, if our practice is in pristine condition, we won't as much. We won't get derailed as much. I can say with assuredness that if something happened to Kobe or Shayna or even my dog or even any of you, I may be derailed for a little bit, but then again, I might not. I might be able to keep my practice, feel my emotions, and be a beacon of whatever for other people if that situation is possible. And I've done that a lot of times, even most recently when there was a situation at the clinic and Bob called me and he was like doom and gloom. And he commented later that, Ernest, I really needed what you did right there. You were cool, calm, collected. You had good ideas. You didn't react to the woe is me. And it turns out it wasn't that big of a deal. So there are times where we'll be those beacons of light and solidity and firmness without faking it, because sometimes people, they just keep it all inside because they want to put on a show. And that, I'm not judging that act either. That could be beneficial. That could have been somewhat appropriate. And I don't want to get into that, but ultimately what we're doing is we're maintaining above the level of active recognition. We know where our mind is. We know where our emotional state is. We know what our body is doing. We know how we feel. And that triangle becomes more solid, and we won't feed the nemesis and we won't feed the destroyers as much. Does that make sense?
Yes,
think-
in the worrying, there's othering, because it's
Yeah.
how other people would look at me if I didn't worry. You know, not much. There wasn't much of this, but there was a recognition of, you know, you're a bad person if you don't worry.
Right. And that's
How
a
can
social convention.
Yeah, that's other people's point of view,
It is.
which really shouldn't affect your practice. If you're practicing, you're doing it for your own well-being and for your loved ones around you, really.
And that's why that's what I would call the social destroyer, because that is a social convention where you live and where a lot of people live, of course. You know, they think that they need to worry, they think that they need to respond this way, or they don't care. And sometimes people will react to that in their own way, you know, because they see that you're not worried or they see that you're not bothered, and then they'll pass their judgments. There's nothing you can do about that. That will be just something else to adapt to and keep swimming. So, and I think the final point that I would want to highlight is that when we give up trying to control, it doesn't necessarily mean that we won't physically suffer, right? So Donna pointed that out, that the physical suffering is still there. My neck still hurts. It's giving me a headache. It's radiating all the way up my, you know, from my neck to my shoulder. And I'll do some of my practices, and I'm just going to do my normal practices. I'm not going to go out of my way to try to fix. And it does help, you know, it does, you know, make a difference. But ultimately, if I want to heal, and if I want the imbalance in my body to correct itself, I have to make sure that that flow in and out is smooth, and I'm not getting in the way, and I'm not interrupting that flow of energy. And then all of a sudden I realize that, oh, this is the way that I'm sleeping. It could have to do with the way that I'm lucid dreaming. And, you know, I'll make adjustments. That's what adaptation is. You make adjustments and you keep moving. Does that all make sense? Does that all kind of tie in? Okay, Donna, did you have something to add? And then,
Yeah, I think we
then-
do need to talk another time about desire, because one of the desires that I've realized lately, and this might sound like I'm bullshitting myself, but it's really true, is that, you know, I look at some of this illness stuff as it's just space junk, you know, just happened to me, you know. So it was a series of circumstances that arose that happened, and so now I'm navigating that. But there's an element of when I was in the most extreme suffering in the waiting room, waiting for someone, and, you know, those holy shit moments, like, holy shit, this body is loud right now. Not to go down the rabbit hole of, you know, what if, you know, they're not taking care of me quick enough, and what if something goes wrong, and what if, and what if, and all the what ifs. And, you know, I recognize pretty quickly that I'm going to navigate that much better if my practice is in place. Those may be true, some of those points, but thinking about them isn't going to help me. And I also think about death as an advisor. I think about them in circumstances where I can feel the panic rising, and go, you know what? If this this could be my time. You know, this could be my time to go. You know, because you keep mentioning if something happens to your dog or to Shayna, I'm sure that you would feel something. You have an attachment there. You've chosen this attachment. Of course, you're going to feel it. And the same thing with Ida and her husband. But I also think about it as my desire is to be engaged in this life, in my life as a human being on the planet. And suffering is part of it sometimes. There's some suffering as part of it. Like Ida, even watching the movie, she wanted to experience the crying with the person, but she could maintain her practice while doing that. And you could be concerned about your husband. There's nothing wrong with being concerned. You don't have to, like, go on with your painting as if nothing nothing's wrong. If I've been in the hospital with people that I love and stayed with them, and it's the same practice as when it was me in the hospital. It is, this could be their time, but it may not be. And we're going to navigate this all more elegantly if I'm practicing and I'm creating an atmosphere of that. It helps them to be in that calm place. And if it is their time, don't you want to be engaged with that person in that way? When you look back on this, I was going crazy. Like it doesn't help anyone. It's detrimental to everyone involved for you to get caught up in psychological suffering to the degree that it is able to be controlled. I have worry about people that I love, but I don't let that be the predominant thing. I keep my practice in place, and then I can ask the doctor appropriate questions. I can walk out of the room when it looks like I'm too intrusive. I can step back in or go get a glass of water or something when they need it. I'm more apt to be participating. I was saying, because I want to be engaged. That's part of the desire for me. I want to experience this life with as much presence as possible because of the way that that feels. I'm on this planet for a limited amount of time, and I want to be engaged for it. When I was taking the ferry over and it was bad weather, and I've never taken the ferry in bad weather. Long Island Sound is not a huge body of water, but it was choppy and there were waves, and the ship was moving so much that we were taking on water. I was in the hull in my car, and all of the car alarms went off because it shook all of the cars, and it was quite an event. And I was filming outside the porthole window because it was so interesting. I was like, I feel like Vasco da Gama on a big sail ship. Of course, I've got my car running and I'm nice and warm, and I'm really not experiencing the suffering he did, but that's what it felt like, the steam coming off the water and ice caps on it, and we took on water, and all the crew ran up on the deck, and I started thinking, gee, I never listened to where the lifeboats are and where the life vests are, and that's probably something I should have paid attention to, because this is the closest to anything like that. And then I thought two things. One is, if my survival kicks in, then I will be practicing when that kicks in, and I will be able to navigate that much more eloquently than I give myself credit for, because I've done that. I've done that as a nurse. I've done that in the past, where you can do unbelievable things, and yeah, your intuition and your instinct take over because you're practiced and you're grounded. Or, and I also said, I'm not going on a lifeboat out in that freezing cold water. If it's my time, I'll just die here in my car. But it still is a really interesting, like, I wish my nephew was filming. Like, it was an exhilarating experience. Even part of it was frightening, but I didn't get unbalanced with the frightening, because my desire, that part of the triangle, is to be engaged, to be connected to my experience, to be connected to the other people that are around me during their experience, during my experience. So, Ida, not just not worrying so that your mind wasn't suffering and you weren't suffering, but also, should it have been your husband's time, wouldn't you have wanted to be as fully present as possible and be with him in those moments, because he's your attachment, you know? And if you had to navigate an emergency with him, you would be much more elegantly able to navigate that because you were practicing. So there's not just, I made myself crazy for nothing, and I could tell by the relief. There's a whole bunch of other things that go along with it, and the desire is part of it. The desire is the connection and the engagement and the balance. And there's a whole bunch of virtues that go along with that are that are part of my desire.
Yep, that makes sense. And that reminds me of that story when I was with my mom and the whole family was there, and she didn't want to do a blood transfusion. She was just going to go ahead and let herself die. And, I was practicing and I was keeping my mind clear, and I came up with the idea. I asked the doctor, let's do a vote, and then she'll see how much everybody wants her to get the blood transfusion. She'll feel that love and see how much everybody cares. and it worked, so I mentioned that to the doctor outside of the room. Let's take a vote. That's an example of what Donna just said. If I would have been in the same emotional turmoil as everybody else, that idea may have never occurred to me. But because I created space, I had a good idea and it worked. So yeah, good example, Donna. Did you have something to add there, William?
Not really. It's just everything I really identify with how Donna explained that, but what I did have a moment when you were talking about your experience outside with your teacher Long, and saying you said I'm letting it go, and I just it's just a moment of kind of an understanding, because it's just like I laugh, but what I have noticed is that sometimes people just like people say, well, you have to let it go, but people to let something go. I'm trying to think how I want to express what I'm saying, but it's like the practice gives you something to. You can't let anything go that you keep thinking about over and over and over. So then you have to have something else to bring you back to the moment, so that you can actually give yourself space for it to be gone. It's like it can't let go, because you're fixating and trying to understand it and re-explain it to yourself and figure it out. It never can go. It can't go. It's something that you realize, okay, this is something I can't solve. This is something that is just something I have to let go. And you can say those words intellectually, but you don't have any way to know how to actually let it go, because your natural inclination is to rethink about it, to process it again. And that's not how it's going to be let go. So you can't.
Right. You can't not do something. You can only do something. So if you're doing the practice, then that's
Right.
how the letting it go dissolves from your consciousness. If you keep going over it and over it in your head as an attempt to let it go, you're doing the opposite, because wherever
Thank you,
focus
Donna.
grows.
Thank you, Donna. I see, Ernest, exactly why Donna has her place with you, because she very well knows how to articulate and bring things together. Thank you. Exactly what I'm trying to say.
That phrase actually took root early on, is because that I think Donna recognized immediately that that's what the rule of three is you can't not do something. What does that even mean? Like, how do you not do something? You have
It's one
you're
not
always doing something.
It's only one not, but you can't.
How can you not?
You cannot not do something. You can't not do something.
You can't.
You can only do something.
I see what you mean.
First.
Yeah.
So I'll just say real quick, and then we could talk about this more next week, but I'll add it to the triangles. So we have this thing that I call the lens of perception. The lens of perception is it's everything. It's your life, it's your memories, it's your surroundings, it's your social environment. All of those things are the lens that is what is focusing what you would call your perception of the moment, how you're viewing it, how you're seeing it, feeling it, tasting it, touching it. All of that perception is like an accumulation of all of that in your mind and your body and your spirit. all three things are active with perception. Does the lens of perception make sense? So if the lens of perception is full of social things and all of the riffraff we see, then everything coming in will be affected by that, and then everything coming out will ultimately also be affected by that. So the lens of perception is something that we'll talk about more and more as we go along, especially when we start to get into hydrostasy. And then we have this other triangle, because you're talking about desire. So for many people, desire is being, I don't want to say infected. I guess I do, because that's what came to mind. But it's being influenced by that lens of perception, desire being influenced by the lens of perception. And if that lens of perception is full of comparing, contrasting, trying to figure it out, labeling, judging, trying to keep up with other people, social destroyer, the biological destroyer, all we're thinking about is sex, drugs, and rock and roll and food, well, then our desire is going to be tied to that. Does that make sense, Donna? So, but what I'm talking about is that when we practice, we clear our lens of perception. And like you said, it doesn't mean that we're emotionless or anything else. It doesn't mean that we'll never be in an extreme. I'm going to be in an extreme because I have attachments, but I'm not going to exist there because I have a practice, and I'll be able to come back to my hydrostasy bubble. I will be able to adapt and ultimately learn. That's the big thing, is I'll be able to learn as I go along. And then the reason that I have this other triangle, which is intelligence, opposite of desire. And in the middle is personal power. Just to represent that all six of these things, when they're in alignment, will equal an immeasurable amount of personal energy, personal power, however we want to define that. It feels like you can do anything, but it's not like cocky confidence. That's something completely different, because that requires words. You'd be surprised, like this, yes, muddy lens, exactly, Ida. Muddied with below the level of recognition. And who knows where now you desire a Ferrari. Why? Oh, because I like vehicles. Well, you could get any vehicle. Why do you need a Ferrari? You know, why do you need it to look this good on the exterior? When we really start to get down to things, most of people's behavior and desires are tied to mating rituals. I want to look a certain way. I want to act a certain way. I want to put off. You don't need thighs of steel and buns of steel if you're not doing anything with it. You know, if you sit down at a desk job all day and, you know, you're not using, so there's a reason. The desire, and again, I'm not judging thighs of steel. I'm just saying that where is the desire coming from? For most people, and sometimes we use the word average or common. It's just a statistical number. It's not a judgment. We're not trying to throw people under the bus, but the common mind, the average mind, their desire is being influenced by this lens of perception. Does that make sense? Sometimes included in that lens of perception are images of perfection. So they want to be this image of perfection. I don't want to, you know, feel suffering, no physical suffering, no psychological suffering, and I will transcend the human experience. Yeah, maybe. I mean, but good luck. I don't know if that's going to work. Good luck going from one extreme to the other and expecting it to have no other extremes. Like our friend, you know, not our friend, but the person that William was mentioning, who is the Navy SEAL. That reminds me a lot of the martial artist who's trying to train for every single event under the sun. And then the one that they'll actually experience will be the one that they never trained for. Because ultimately we're looking in this practice to train to be adaptable to things that we've never experienced. So if I give William a puzzle that he has no knowledge of, and when I use the word knowledge, he has no information, he has no personal experience, and he's never been given the experience from another person. It's totally foreign to him. But yet he solves the puzzle. He used intelligence. He used raw intelligence to circumvent knowledge unto wisdom. And we could do a whole, you know, class/lecture on this. We actually did it last week a little bit with knowledge, intelligence, and wisdom. So the key here is that with our practice, we're not below the level of recognition. Therefore, we're not feeding the four destroyers and the secret fifth, which is the collective momentum of humanity, which is just a hot shamble of shit in a lot of regards. And these two get closer together. They start to work together. Our desire starts to intermingle with our intelligence. And then before you know it, the desires that we have are intelligent desires. And intelligent, I mean, it's like a universal intelligence. The body wants to be whole. It doesn't want to end. It wants to survive. So as much as Donna says that she would sit there in the car and sync with it, she wouldn't. Her body would kick in, that fundamental intelligence on the cellular level. She would fight to save her own life. Even if that meant, you know, gasping for breath underwater. That is a reaction. That is the body's intelligence trying to save itself. So ultimately, with this practice, we're above active recognition. And I don't like looking at it as a level. It's just a binary thing. Your attention is either deliberate, on purpose, and specifically placed, or it's not. And if it's not, you are very likely acting on memory, habit. And again, not our mind is going to create habit. But if we're cognitively aware, if we're behaviorally aware, if we're energetically aware, we'll always see when habits start to get outside of our balance, our principle of balance. So with our practice, we're above the level of recognition. We're not feeding our destroyers. Our lens of perception starts to clear up. The way that we see life, the way that we see the universe, physically as well as psychologically, changes. Does that make sense? And then all of a sudden, our desire is fundamentally connected to universal intelligence. And if that's the case, we'll stop killing one another for land that there's plenty of. We'll stop hurting each other when there's no need. We'll stop trying to cling and attach to things because we know that we can't take any of it with us. And things will start to balance on Earth in the human species because desire and intelligence are closer together rather than our desire being influenced by a muddy lens of perception. Does that make sense? And I view that as a potential solution to the debacle that humanity has gotten themselves into, which is attempting to control, manipulate, trying to understand, and it's all fear-driven. In traditional Chinese medicine, they have a different emotion tied to different organs. All of them are connected to fear. All of them. The reason that we want to exist in these extremes is because we're afraid of them going away. Does that all make sense? And I'm not talking about flight or fight. That's a part of the body's intelligence. That should be there to a certain extent. Again, if you exist in an extreme and you let it take you away, now you're not operating logically and intelligently, you're acting fear-based. And it lends to the psychological fear, which lends to the physical fear. And then before you know it, you're afraid of a tiger that isn't even in the room. There is no tiger. Why are you afraid of the tiger? Because your nervous system doesn't know the difference. When you're thinking about those things, it has no idea that it's not real, that it's not in the room, and our body responds with a very similar, if not the same, electrochemical, physiological, and hormonal response. That has a lot to do with PTSD. PTSD has a lot to do with that cycle, that system. The nervous system doesn't know that those pans aren't a bomb because it's so traumatic in the person's experience that their nervous system is responding with that type of response inappropriate for the situation. Does that make sense? Yes, William.
Yeah, it does. And, I think that's kind of funny enough, what COVID did. I think it's like that's people didn't know enough about it, how it was being transmitted, how virulent it was at the time. So it was like the tiger in the room in a sense of made me think of that, because I realized that actually COVID helped me tune myself into my practice more, because that was my first time really just having anxiety in a different way than I was accustomed to. For a variety of reasons, my father at that time, who passed, was 92, living with me, and I still was going out having to work. So I thought, I was always concerned I was bringing something in that was going to affect him. And anytime he coughed or anything, I thought, oh my God. And it was just my sister, she, very overweight and obese. And so, I've realized that her immune system might not be strong. And I just didn't know enough about, so we were like, anything I brought in the house, I took my clothes off before I was coming in the house. We would go to the store, we spraying the packages and stuff down because we thought it was like all of that and so what I was trying to say is like a tiger room. I didn't know. And I created this thing in my mind, and it just created overall anxiety and fear that I was experiencing in my body. And I was like, what is this feeling that I'm having? And I was like, oh, this is anxiety. Like in my previous experience, I really probably didn't understand anxiety as much as I did through the beginning stages of when COVID. I remember someone coughing. My house, I sit on a corner, and there's a lot of traffic that goes around my property. And I remember looking out the window, and I saw this woman. They stopped at the corner. She was opened her door, and she was coughing, and she threw up. And I freaked out. Literally, my mind was like, oh my God, she just spread a COVID bomb. And it spread. And my sister, I told my sister was like, should you go out and spray that with bleach? Should you do that? And I was just like, and I sat back, I said, man, I'm just like, we just out here, we're tripping now. Our minds are creating so much just like all over the place because of the unknown. And so when you said that, it's like it was a tiger in the room for me at the time. It wasn't PTSD necessarily, but it was just this unknown that triggered all type of reactions. And I had to really lean into my practice and start focusing deeper, because I realized that for whatever reason, this unknown and the whole social, the people, I cut the TV down. I told my sisters, you got to stop listening to all this stuff, because it's not, we can only do what we can do. The rest of this is just constantly stirring up. And it goes back to that lens of perception. It was like all this information is not really helping me do anything. It's just making me more afraid and muddying the waters of my perception, as opposed. So I just leaned into my practice, because like that's all I got. All I can do is like deal with me, and whatever happens, like, you know, Donald says, like, if I get COVID, I'm gonna get COVID. If I have to come to the point that I accept it. Like, I'm not gonna just go out here and, you know, put myself in the scenario. I wore a mask. I did, you know, but at the same time, you know, I can debate that were masks working, not working, but really, essentially, do what you can, and then you have to find a place in yourself that, you know, you accept what maybe outcomes may come, and you don't, you know, and that's kind of interesting. This, you know, put it all together.
Yeah.
Well, that's comes from your practice, your Tai Chi practice. I'm sure your boxing practice, you understand what balance feels like. And you recognized that the thinking about the COVID and worrying about the COVID and watching the TV about the COVID, to the degree that you were, was out of balance, and it was pulling you out of balance so that you were feeling anxiety. And by doing your practice, it helped you reestablish a sense of balance while still being mindful of COVID.
Yeah. And then, you know, to kind of address what Jerry said, that, you know, a DNA based thing, you know, every animal will have the ability when in danger to have an electrochemical physiological response that will help them get out of danger. You'll run faster than you've ever ran, you know, when that flight or fight response.
Yes, some of them just freeze. Some of them just freeze right in the spot and they get killed fast. I think I'm one of those. Just kill me fast. I'm not interested in the extremes.
But that's also a response, Donna. That's also a response that many animals do. If I stop right now, you won't see me. You won't see me. If I don't move.
Yeah, maybe I'll do that one.
Yeah, I doubt it.
I choose that one.
You say that psychologically, but I doubt it. The body's intelligence will kick in, and you'll do something to save your own life, especially if another person's involved, because now you have to save another person's life as well. So both of those things will start to work in tandem. And also kind of, this is a side point, but a lot of native cultures have observed how a certain animal of prey, of predator, can freeze the animal of prey with the way that it looks, its stare. So it's not always, you know, the deer in headlights or the possum playing dead. In some instances, the predator has used their intention and their attention to freeze the other animal. This can actually be seen in human beings too, because there's certain people who have a certain type of energy, you know, they can turn it on and off at will, where you just know you're not going to fuck with them. You just know.
That's the premise of the stare down in martial arts. Really, that's the premise of the boxer staring down. Yep. Mike Tyson was, you know, his thing was, if I can break you before we fight with this, the way I look at you, that imprint is on you. Even when you're still gonna fight, right? But you've already kind of just like decided, you know, I'm not gonna fight to my full capability. I just kind of already know I'm gonna die. I just don't, you know, it's like you break them with that. And so, yeah, that's a very important point, that, you know, that is a power that people possess, the ability to use their stare, their intent through their eyes to kind of overcome you.
Yep. And if we really look at what's occurring, the intent is tied to attention. So we have intention with attention through the eyes. You know that when they're doing that, like if they're doing that stare down, Mike Tyson's attention isn't over here. It's locked on you, you know, looking right at you. So you have intention, the power of will, with attention and desire, because his desire is to get in your head. So all of it is the exact same example. And that's what we talk about. Sometimes people can generate micro examples of what we're talking about. We're looking at a macro example to where we're able to apply it to everything in our lives. not staring people down, that's not necessarily what I mean, but the ability to lock our intention with our attention, because oftentimes attention is completely, we don't know where our desire is. We don't know where our true intentions are because we're too busy acting out habits. And then someone is like, no, I didn't really intend to punch that guy in the mouth. I don't know what came over me. What came over you was habit, was the momentum, was the below recognition. So in a lot of ways, what Jerry said is true, that we do have this innate intelligence in our body that will help us get out of certain situations. And before you know it, you ran up a tree faster than you've ever ran, and you've never climbed a tree a day in your life. And here you are at the top, and you had that capability. Now, again, maybe Donna's saying that she wouldn't do that, but she would probably run into the burning building to save the baby. That's the same thing. It's the same thing occurring. It's she chose to fight over the flight is kind of the way that we're looking at that. What we're talking about is psychological fear. That's different. That's a completely different ballgame, because there is no tiger necessarily in the room. William was able to isolate the example of anxiety, which is a fear based in the future. It's a fear of what could happen or what might happen, and it's creating a psychological time with psychological fear that creates the emotion that we want to call anxiety. And it's common in a lot of different ways, and it manifests itself in a lot of different ways. And that is absolutely something that we can condition ourselves out of with this practice. And when we look at those two triangles, that gives an excellent explanation of what's occurring. Why does it occur this way? Because now our attention is keenly tied with our desire, and our desire is keenly tied with intelligence. The desire of most human beings is not intelligent. I'll stop the recording so I don't offend too many.